Well, hey y'all, it's Rob and Chris, and we're here to talk a little bit and have sort of share some reflections about our recent pilgrimage trip over to the UK. So, for those of you who might not know, we started off our trip. We flew into Manchester, which is sort of the northern region of England, and got on a bus, went to some sort of small villages, and then wound up in York. And we stayed a couple days in York, moved on up to Durham or Gateshead. Stayed a couple days there, moved on up to Bamborough and saw Lindisfarne, stayed there for a couple days, and then we're in Edinburgh to round out the trip. And that's a sort of very brief synopsis of this entire journey that we took. But all of the sort of magic that happened in the in-between time is what Chris and I are here to discuss and to sort of have a conversation about. Just a sort of way to kind of offer a final reflection on the trip. So Chris, I'll just sort of throw a question out there for you. Did you have any sort of highlights or favorite moments of the trip that you would like to share with our listeners?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there were a number of elements. I mean, to try and pick a single favorite out of a 10-day trip spanning, hundreds of miles, beautiful sights and sounds is really difficult. But the two that I would say really stand out to me, one of which was Fountains Abbey, which was when we were making our way up north, sort of when we were in our time around, on our way up to Durham, I believe, between York and Durham. Mm-hmm. And this is in the ruins of an old monastery that
Cistercian monastery. Yeah.
Was still enough intact that you could, get a glimpse into that time period and that past. And the story behind it is really interesting in and of itself, where the monks were seeking a more simplistic life and decided that the way to do that was to go build this incredible monastery that kind of, as it was explained to us, became an economic powerhouse, really, in a lot of ways. So that, seeing how that ended up playing out for them is interesting in and of itself. But the sheer visual impact of going to these giant open fields initially that are just the greenest grass you've ever seen, ultimately leading to these towering, buildings that are still largely intact in a lot of ways, enough that you can certainly see the general structure of everything, was just very, very shocking and in a really inspiring way to think how could they have built this at the time they did, and how it almost felt like you were standing in the representation of every the source of inspiration for every modern medieval fantasy. It felt like you could feel
the grounds are sort of romantic and evocative of that sort of thing.
Yes. Okay. It kind of is unique to see how that legacy in some ways almost feels like has continued on to modern day, even though it was built. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I mean, I believe it was around the Middle Ages. Yeah. I mean, 1,000 years ago is very impactful in a way. I'm not necessarily a self-proclaimed nature lover. I love nature, but I wouldn't, categorize myself that way. But it was just really, really impactful to me. And the second thing, as people who are familiar with me might know, I would say I'm a music lover. And so
just a bit.
We got to go to a couple of evensongs, one at York, which was fantastic. I mean, it feels like you are being in a situation that is an institution. I mean, this is evensong happens on a regular basis over there for them. It has been for hundreds of years, and it is a beautiful, beautiful space, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. But I will say, the evensong on our last day at
St. Mary's Episcopal Cathedral
in Edinburgh, was truly the perfect way to end this trip. I mean, it's an evening service, it's contemplative, it's reflective, and obviously that musical element was very impactful on me. And they actually did a piece that they mentioned was composed by a former chorister
there. Chorister, yes.
And it was something I'd never heard before, and it was just very, very cool to get to see something that was a piece of their history that we're kind of getting to witness in real time, on top of them just being an incredible choir.
To pick up on that, so one of the things that one of the pilgrims said to me, they asked the question, they said, do they do evensong every day at St. Mary's Cathedral? I said, yeah, I think they do. And there was a schedule that said, here's what we do, evensongs every night at like 5:30, 6 o'clock, whatever it was. Right. And he said, well, even when there's no congregation? I said, yeah. And it took this person by surprise, and I said, the thing to remember about Evensong, the thing to remember about kind of the worship that takes place in the cathedral is that the audience is God. You know, God is the audience, and it's not necessarily who all is in the congregation, even if it's just the choir, which I'm sure happens every once in a while.
Right.
That they're offering this praise of God that is meant to just, you know, this is the life of this cathedral. That's what we're here to do. We're meant to glorify God. And if there's no one in the congregation, if there's 100 people in the congregation, whatever it is, they're there to do that every single day, which I thought that was a really neat kind of way to end the trip as well.
Absolutely.
I would absolutely agree with you. Now, what's funny, on the day that y'all were wandering around York, y'all were out in Fountains and Ripon, I was wandering around York.
Right. You were getting every cathedral and church you could possibly find.
I did this sort of tricky trot all through York and saw probably 10 or 15 churches.
Which you posted about on our Facebook page.
Which I did. I posted those pictures
with very detailed descriptions.
on the Facebook page. But the thing that fascinated me about that experience was that, one, all of those churches were open.
Right.
Which, you don't always get that. Even in England, you know, across England, that's not going to be the case. But all of those churches were not just open, but they all still had, most of them, active congregations. Maybe small, but still active congregations that were keeping those places open. And in some instances, there were people like, you know, wardens and flower guild members and choristers and whatnot that were sort of milling around in these very small parishes, which was really neat to see. One of my favorites was the bombed out church of St. Martin.
Right.
St. Martin of Tours, it was like the south aisle was all that was left. And they built this church sort of in the remainder of the bombed out building that was bombed in World War II. It's pretty cool.
Wow.
Pretty cool to be in there. I don't remember if I showed a picture of the organ.
I don't know if I saw that one.
Go back and look at it. It's pretty interesting. It's this sort of weird box, and there's this sort of plexiglass thing, and what looks like an organ is sort of suspended up in the mid-air. It's really cool.
Wow.
So anyway. Well, so in terms of the spiritual impact that this trip had on you, how would you quantify that? What would you say about the sort of the spiritual nature of what we did?
I think, in addition to the Evensong kind of being an instance where I felt very at peace, very, you know, something that is personally meaningful to me, as music is an important part of the way I worship. Another instance where it really stood out to me was one of our first days when we went to York Minster, and myself, my wife, you, and a couple of others of us, after we kind of split off from our tour that was still wrapping up, because they were getting ready to start a new Eucharist. And it was obviously, again, like I said about York Minster, I mean, when you're in a space like that, it's immediately impactful in the sense that you can feel the history behind it. I mean, the scope of it all is something that you can't ignore. But even with all of that, the new Eucharist took place in a back chapel at the back end of the church.
Lady chapel, yeah.
And it was a relatively small group of us, maybe 10, 15 people. And it was almost exactly like the new Eucharist we have here at Grace. And it was striking in that we are thousands of miles away from home in a completely different city, in a completely different culture. And yet that one element was almost the exact same. And I think that kind of universal connection was very impactful to me in that moment. And on top of just getting to have a Eucharist.
That, you know, I share that because I remember sitting in that Eucharist and thinking to myself, you know, in 5 hours' time, because we're 5 hours ahead in the UK, in 5 hours' time, our congregation at Grace Church Cathedral is going to hear the same lessons that we just heard and do the same thing with the Eucharist that we're doing.
Right.
And that's just kind of neat. That was a really kind of, wow, you know, that really gives you a sense of the universality and the kind of the Catholic, in little KC, nature of the church, which was really cool.
Right. I mean, we say that in the prayers. We pray for places all over the world. We pray for, Bishop Ruth. We pray for Michael, our presiding bishop, and
Justin, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Exactly. You know, we're constantly reminded of this sort of larger scale element of our worshiping and of our religion, and to be able to experience that in a very identifiable way was really interesting.
So, okay, cool.
But,
well, one of my favorite things that happened on this trip was I can't remember what day it was, but we went down to Sea Houses, which is a small little sort of village on the North Sea coast. It's just a few miles away from the Farne Islands, and Inner Farne is the island where St. Cuthbert spent most of his hermitage existence, and it's where he died. And in terms of the sort of the centers of English Christianity, Inner Farne and, and Lindisfarne, that's it. Those are big things. And the Farne Islands is it's a network of islands off the coast. They're quite remote.
Yes.
And not very accessible. And Cuthbert lived on the one that was closest to the coast, but still, you're talking 3 miles off the coast, and it's not easy to get to. We had perfect, and I do mean perfect, weather for this experience.
Absolutely.
And we got on a boat and went out there, but even in the perfect weather, you got a sense of how difficult and how absolutely remote St. Cuthbert's existence on this island would have been. And touring around, seeing all these birds and seals everywhere,
A lot of seals.
just the beauty of the natural world that we were seeing. I think it really stunned everybody to see that much just raw, the raw beauty of creation. And someone commented to me on the way back, or we were on the bus ride back to where we were staying, and they said, that was one of my favorite experiences. What a great idea to do that. I'm not sure how spiritual it was, but it really was rewarding. I was like, wait a minute now. That was incredibly spiritual, because what you got to see was, one, just the kind of conditions that St. Cuthbert would have known that would have allowed people to go see him, but also you get a sense of how difficult a prayer life would have been that far out.
Right.
And surrounded by that much sort of the wilds of nature. And so I think that gave all of us a little deeper appreciation into the kind of life or the kind of surroundings one would have been in as one prayed, as one began to sort of tread the depths of one's spiritual walk. I thought it was great. So
well, and I think that's kind of a common thread throughout the entire trip, where some of the things we did were immediately apparent how it connects back to our spirituality and obviously the history of the church, like York Minster, Durham Cathedral, Ripon, Hexham Abbey, all these places that are obvious. And then there were certain elements like we went to a very, very small town called Bishop Auckland that was, we got lunch, a couple of us, while we were there, and someone asked, they could tell from our accents, believe it or not, that we weren't locals. They said we said water wrong. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how. And they asked, what were we doing there? The town is in the middle of a restoration project where it had kind of fallen into disrepair. They, I believe they said it was during the coal industry when that was no longer allowed to, coal had restrictions placed on it over there because of the health risks, and it kind of tore this town apart.
It ripped it to shreds.
In the sense that that was their source of income, that was their livelihood. And in the last decade, they have started a restoration project to try to bring tourism back to that town, to try to build the economy back up. And talking to one of the locals there was one of those spiritual instances for me on this trip, because getting to hear them talk about, they were retired. They came back and work in this town 2 or 3 times a week because that project is important to them, to try to make a difference and try to help these people that are living a more difficult lifestyle. And I think seeing that in person in an entirely new place that to us, we see a very small chunk of it on our time there. And if no one had said anything to that nature while we were there, I would have thought, oh, this is just another small, nice little town. Right. But to know the story behind it and to know that us being there was, hopefully making a positive difference, but also getting to see the people who do live there working towards making a difference themselves. I think that was inspiring in a way that you see community coming together, in a spiritual way.
No, that's true. I would agree with that. And that was actually one of the bigger surprises that I had on that trip. Because when I was at the University of Durham, this is in the early 2000s, Bishop Auckland had a terrible reputation. You just didn't go there. There was no reason, because it was just sort of an industrial wasteland, or at least just a very impoverished place. There was nothing really to recommend it. Right. And this, I can't remember the fellow's name, but this one philanthropist coming in and saying, I'm a third of my net worth, and this is a billionaire, is going to go into the refurbishment of Bishop Auckland. And to see how the townspeople are sort of rallying around this and basically saying, we want to help bring this back up too. We're going to help do everything that needs to be done. So that was cool. That was a big surprise because when I first heard we were going to Bishop Auckland, I was like, really? Okay, fair enough. That but it was good. It was a really cool thing. So, well, closing thoughts, parting thoughts, anything that you would say to anyone thinking about going on a pilgrimage in the future like this?
I mean, for me, it was an eye-opening experience for all the reasons we just said, and more that we would be talking for much longer.
About to say we could do several installments about this, but yes. Okay.
In the ways that we were saying, where the history of the church is something that, to me, I know much less about than I would like, and I think that getting to go to places where you can live in it and see it being lived out, both currently and having the benefit of a tour guide walking you through each different part and explaining, well, this part from 1,000 years ago has this impact today. I mean, getting to connect those two elements, the history and the modernity, both from a cultural standpoint, which has its own benefits that I think we can apply to our daily lives, which also plays into our faith as well, but also the elements of the history of the church itself, I think allows you to have a certain level of additional reverence and adding an entirely new perspective on how you can, live that out ourselves. But what about you, especially as someone who has already spent a lot of time over there? What about this trip was new?
The great thing, and I think that there was one member in particular who kind of put the fine point on it. It was probably the fifth or sixth night that we were on the tour, and everyone was together in the same dining place. It was before supper. It was just kind of everyone was hanging out, and everyone was having a great time. Everyone was, at that particular point in the trip, everyone had a chance to kind of interact with everybody else. And you have a group of people that might have known a small segment of the others who went on the trip. But by day 5, day 6, everyone knew everyone else.
Right.
And we were all kind of like, we're in this together, and that just sort of the sense of camaraderie, that sense of cohesion was palpable. And this one of the pilgrims just leaned over to me and she said, "This is a good group. We've done it. We're all together on this." And I said, "Absolutely, that's right. We are all together on this." And I think that anytime you have a chance to do something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, it's a little bit taking you farther afield with a group of people that but you don't really know, or you see them across the aisle, or you see them in a different pew and you say, "Oh yeah, I know who that person is. I kind of know their name, but I don't really know much about them." Being on a trip like this gives you an opportunity to have some interactions, get to know them a little bit. And there's even some people that I've known my whole life, or have known me my whole life, that I learned something new about. And that was just a really cool experience to sort of get to know some folks a little bit better, and to realize, wow, okay, what a joy it is to be in community and to have these neat experiences with other people. It's just one of the cool things. So I would say anyone thinking about going on a pilgrimage, whether through Grace or somewhere else, it's awesome. It's a fantastic experience. So
couldn't agree more.
So yes, well, stay tuned. You'll hear more.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.